I'm Josh Barrow, host of Left, Right, and Center, KCRW's weekly forum for civilized debate across the political spectrum. Today's news cycle demands more time for deeper analysis, so Left, Right, and Center is now a full hour every week. Subscribe and listen at kcrw.com/LRC.
On To The Point, we try to make sense of the policy debates and the political sideshows on the campaign trail.
Neither party's agenda really aligns with who its coalition is today.
It was the dumbest speech I have ever seen in my life of covering politics.
When people walk into a voting booth, at the end of the day, they do say, I really should vote for someone smarter than me.
I'm Warren Altney. To The Point has you covered for the 2016 campaign. Find the To The Point podcast on KCRW's iTunes page.
From KCRW Santa Monica and KCRW.com, it's The Treatment. Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. I guess I probably came to Sleater-Kinney a little late, about the time of the Hot Rock, and actually happened to see them play when the little band from Detroit that I love opened for them called the White Stripes, and the interplay between the two groups was really something. It gave me a chance to see the kind of, I think, the winning wiggliness and physical confidence of Sleater-Kinney on stage. Later got a chance to see Carrie Brownstein bring that to the small screen, to film, the sketches she did with Fred Armisen, which became the show Portlandia, which is now about to begin its 6th season. Her memoir, which feels like a kind of a post-punk Roland Barthes look at suburban life, is Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl, which if you know Sleater-Kinney, you know where that title comes from. First of all, Carrie, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The book does feel like this kind of Barthes sort of post-punk, or look at post-punk and the world that came out of that. And I just find that there's something about you that has really absorbs detail.
I've always been a keen observer. I think certain situations in my life, starting with my childhood, kind of called on me to assess and grapple with things that were a little bit chaotic or moving parts, but there wasn't a disdain for that. It actually made me really interested in the ways that people interact with one another, also the ways that people perform personhood or couplehood, and that's definitely entered certainly into Portlandia. I think a lot of it is about observing sort of situations and the ways people interact. But even in Sleater-Kinney, I felt like I was always kind of in a strange position of performing, but also being asked to comment on the performance. But that's always felt very innate for me. And I like to sit back and be an observer sometimes. So yeah, I think the book was a little bit of an extension of that, different vignettes in my life that kind of added up to who I am and what I'm trying to do.
Well, it even starts off with, but early in the book, you were talking about going to that first Madonna concert and getting into costume for that, and finally picking the costume, and then being the one person who wasn't in the picture of all the Madonna dress-alike standing in line for the show.
Yes, any self-respecting Madonna fan at the time, which was during the Like a Virgin era, which is her breakout record. You know, most of the fans wore lace. That was the look for her fans, or a wedding dress, which is what I asked my mom if I could wear. I think she wisely said no. I don't think that's what most moms want their daughters to borrow their wedding dress for, as a pop concert. Nor was she willing to go and purchase me some, thrift store wedding dress. I was pretty young. I was in 5th grade. So I ended up in a shirt by the brand Esprit. Yeah, a classic 80s brand, adorned with exotic fruits. And no, I did not make it into the Seattle Times photo of all the women lined up for the show. I'm sure they just looked at me and said, next, let's get the real Madonna fans in here.
Well, when I met you, when you guys came to Lackman, we showed a couple of episodes of Portlandia to talk about that. I just talked about there's a psychological deportment that I find you that's like an actor. Mm-hmm. And so much of the description in the book is almost like the kind of psychological detailing that an actor would do to get into character.
I guess that's very innate for me. I think that kind of internal kind of spiraling. I feel like I often place myself on a certain axis or a certain precipice and kind of stay there until I am aware of the 360 degrees around me. And then I'm a completist, I guess, in that way. And then once I sort of, do the full turn and sort of bore downwards as far as I can, then I move on to the next place. And I think that can be intense for people. And it's sometimes intense for me, I think, just having things be very deep and experiential. It's almost exhausting sometimes, but it served me well in my work, I think, to be porous like that and to kind of let things in. But it does create a sensitivity. I think part of my book is kind of coming to terms with that sensitivity, how it served me as an artist, instead of trying to reject it or close off to that tenderness, I think.
Well, so much of what I think of good acting is that sort of feeling of possession. And there's a section of the book you write about metamorphosis and how a lot of metamorphosis, that final moment you realize you're rejecting what you used to be to become something else. But there's a part of you that doesn't want to reject that part that you used to be, but you want to be something else at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky dichotomy. I think the other thing is realizing that, or coming to terms with the acceptance of what is constant. That there are certain aspects of oneself that I don't think that you can completely shed. And I think that creates a very divided self that I think can operate with a duality that's uncomfortable and instead of exciting. So I think, one way of metamorphosizing is actually is a little bit more of a transfiguration instead of a complete discarding of oneself, because I think that there can be something, a process of self-alienation and self-effacement with that. I think you can grow and change without completely divorcing yourself from an earlier version. And in fact, I think accepting that earlier version is much more holistic. That continuum is much more interesting to me, and having a relationship to your past self. I think about that with politicians all the time, this idea of just kind of shedding, I used to be like this, but now I'm like this. It's just no, it's a process. That's what is human about us. I'm much more interested in that this evolution and the remnants of our past, as much as I am about the embracing of the future.
It's the treatment we're talking about. A lot of things, but my guess is Carrie Brownstein. Her memoir is Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl. I just found myself, you tend to not reject things really in general a lot. And of all things, I was really fascinated to find out that somebody who sort of helped you find yourself on stage in a way was John Spencer. That was kind of shocking to me.
I know. I just saw John Spencer again. Sleater-Kinney played a series of shows right before the end of the year. And John came to one of the New York shows. And I had been thinking about him because you're not the first person to bring up John Spencer, who was a band, the Blues Explosion, was a band pretty popular in the early 90s. And
my collective soul.
Yeah. Ouch. They were very self-referential. Oh, you're cracking yourself up over there.
You wrote that in the book.
I know.
Mentioned that.
I
just like the idea that your dad was a collective soul.
Yeah. And but John taught me how to stretch and warm up. He was a very kinetic performer, very physical, it was all cloaked in this sort of self-referential persona. It was just a constant, it was this boomerang.
They're basically calling themselves out in their own songs and very meta, and basically they're almost for themselves rather than for an audience.
Yeah, it was the most self-affirming band. It was lots of self-esteem. Or lack thereof. That they're like, oh, I almost forgot we're halfway through the song. We better mention who we are again, just in case we forget. But they were so wonderful to us and generous, and I think he was always a little mystified by me. I was young and a little bit irascible and hard to kind of pin down at the time, I think. But he was an exciting performer to watch, and he definitely I kind of studied him, the way that he was just kind of a rubber band up there on stage.
No, I just found too that I was talking to you before, I guess, sit down about the way you sort of pay attention to the way people dress, and then for that Madonna excerpt, or when you first sort of get into that music scene, you dress in the outfit you think is going to be perfect when you're wearing the vest and the T-shirt, and you step into the room, oh, she's wearing black. Why didn't I make that choice? And you're, rather than putting yourself down for you, say, well, what do I learn from this? And that's something that exists in every situation here where you're asking yourself, what can I pick up from this?
Yeah, I still do that. I do that when I overshare. This is something that, and when I witness oversharing, I wonder what it is, like what that need was and why in a certain instance. And I'm not talking about with friends. I'm talking about in these sort of pseudo-public, transactional kind of interactions, like at a bank, where I hear somebody in front of me in line telling the bank teller about going to the dentist, or when I get in line at the grocery store and I'm buying a brand of yogurt that has a little kangaroo on it, and I let the cashier know that I've been to Australia. Why? It's so embarrassing. And yet at the same time, it's very curious to me, like what the underlying urge is there. And I try not to be critical. I mean, I'm using a very benign example, but I think even in terms of like grander or more dire instances, I think one thing I've tried to do is become less critical of those failures or those embarrassments.
Well, there's a word you use in the book that I really kind of cotton to, and I think it really speaks to a lot of this, and to the way you sort of put yourself in character in the show is presentational. And that's a really, again, a very specific kind of word to use. It's about something that's kind of big and almost theatrical in some kind of way, and kind of unreal.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a word I think that continues to have prominence in our culture, because with social media, almost everything feels presentational. It feels like, we're always performing on a series of very small stages and kind of waiting for a certain amount of applause via likes or enthusiasm, thumbs up, whatever it is. But I like the ways people are presentational, even in terms of conversation, or like I said earlier, I love the way people kind of present themselves as couples, or people sort of present themselves as brands. Like that to me.
I was thinking about when you said couples and present themselves, the therapist that you guys saw as a man, that couple,
Yeah.
a therapy couple.
Yeah, a therapy couple. And they were couples therapists.
Who were a couple.
Yeah, there's so many layers to that. So many layers that I think like probably weren't up to code in any way. I guess I am fascinated by like persona versus personhood, and sort of where those intertwine and where they can separate, and
how much of people is presentational versus showing who they really are.
Yeah, and when does that not even matter? Like when does that when does the presentational version of ourself supersede what we thought was our true self? I mean, it gets into some ontological questions, but it does start to feel like, everything becomes more and more kind of curated. And we sometimes, I don't know, I feel sometimes like a subject in my own curated life a little bit.
Yeah?
Especially, well, I mean, from the outside, but I just feel like the more we sort of set our lives up in this way, where I think about like the way we curate our desktop or, our phones, and we kind of filter out everything that we don't want, like the information from the people that we don't want, the opinions that we don't want, so that all we're getting this like very like esoteric and very much designed for our own tastes feed. And I think that people do that in their real lives. They move to neighborhoods where, just like their phone, they have the exact kind of people around them, the exact kind of coffee shop around them. And I think that's kind of a problem. I think that like, I'm not surprised that people are taken aback by conflict, because right now, like, people are sort of patting themselves slipper-wise, and like it's like we're in this age of slippers in terms of how we're constructing ourselves and our neighborhoods. And then there's something like, oh wait, there's real conflict out in other places. It's like, yes, not everybody has the privilege of tailoring their lives in this way. So that's what I mean by like starting to feel like a subject and a curated. Like you have to be a little bit more of a willful protagonist, I think, and get out there.
Wow. Well, we're getting a little epistemological with my guest, Carrie Brownstein. Her memoir is Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl. We, of course, know her from Portlandia and Slater Kinney's The Treatment. There's more to come. Stay with us.
Ever wish you could hear KCRW's signature music programming wherever and whenever you want? You can with Eclectic 24. Our ever-expanding all-music stream is available worldwide 24/7 online. You can listen to KCRW's diverse music mix on the go or in the car through your iPhone or Android phone app. KCRW's Eclectic 24, where and when you want it. Check it out. Go to kcrw.com/eclectic24.
Welcome back. It's The Treatment. If you know public radio and you know the blog Monitor Mix, you know my guest.
Deep cut.
Carrie Brownstein. In fact, some of the chapter titles kind of made their way into various blog posts on Monitor Mix.
Yeah.
And you've certainly got a sense of who she was. And if you know her reviews of video games, I still think back to that great piece about Rock Band, which apparently is more authentic than American Idol. But her memoirs... His Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl. But I loved that. I loved the blog, and I just loved that. Like the book, it's so much about trying to find a way to not deal with the world in reductive terms. Mm-hmm. And as you were being reductive, you would stop yourself in the middle of it almost every time.
Well, that sounds cumbersome. Yeah.
But yet it happened.
It happened. Man, it's cumbersome. Sometimes I read a lot, and when I'm reading things with more, I'm just like, look at how there's so much conviction here. Just get there and stay there. I'm so, even in my writing, I feel like I'm sometimes peripatetic. I'm just like boing, 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 boing all over the place. But, I mean, that's selling myself a little short. But I do think that the process is exposed for me sometimes. And I don't mind that because I like the way that, I think everything is a tool for connection. The blog definitely was. And I like, especially the medium of a blog, that it's malleable because you then enter a dialogue at the end of the post through the comment section, which can be a total crapshoot, but sometimes it can also be really interesting. And then there's... Because
you talk about in the book how after reading a few reviews, you stop reading reviews, but you can go to the comment section?
Of my own blog piece, yes, because but I wouldn't want to read something about me and then go and read more about me in the comment section. That sounds like some self-flagellation and a rabbit hole. But with the blog in particular, I mean, I was sort of offering up an opinion about something, and so I was curious. I feel like being open to constructive criticism or counter-arguments, I mean, that seems to me important in that medium, if you're the one putting the information out there.
Well, the reason, though, I bring up Monitor Mix, because it feels like just as I was reading the book, so much of it made me think back to that. And made me think about there's a sort of constant state of assessment in the way you view the world. And it almost feels like the blog post that got you started thinking about maybe doing a book at some point.
Absolutely. I think when I inserted myself into the narrative of the posts and I realized, well, this is a unique perspective that I have that someone else writing about music doesn't have, because I played music for X amount of years and I had a specific set of circumstances. That was what was most engaging to the reader. And that made me think, well, instead of kind of writing a book that's kind of music criticism or cultural criticism, I can put a little bit of those polemics in there, but perhaps better to talk about these things through my own purview and story.
I guess I wonder, too, I'm asking this because it seems like in some way almost writing these things down helps you deal with certain kinds of trauma. And I think back to the section you were writing about dealing with your mom's anorexia and talking about you becoming a reporter as you detailed all that. And it became a way to clearly a way to lessen the pain, but also to understand yourself and understand how other people were reacting to all these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I think, because the process of writing a book it doesn't really address the trauma, because the only trauma you're addressing is the trauma of writing a book. You know what I mean? Was
it traumatic writing a book?
Not traumatic in
not capital T traumatic, but still.
It's difficult. I think anyone would be lying if they say, or they would be extremely lucky if anyone is saying that it's easy to write a book. I mean, I think everyone I know that's embarked on that process has dealt with themselves as their own worst enemy. It has doubts. finds really elaborate ways to procrastinate, deals with deadlines in ways that you just feel that feels crushing. I mean, it's just, there's no magic to it. At a certain point, you are sitting down and writing. There's nothing that you can do.
Well, I would think that you're somebody who likes the idea of sitting there. It doesn't feel like it's discipline to me as much as the idea.
I like the idea. The idea of it is amazing. Doing it.
Forgive my imprecision. I thought you liked the discipline of it. Because that's something that clearly it drives you. The idea of application and execution and result.
Yes, and I approached it assiduously and deliberately and studiously, and you're correct that I do appreciate that in terms of the discipline and just the world of it is exciting to me. However, I think with autobiography, our memories are very multifaceted. They exist in color, and they exist like mansions in our minds, and you go to write about it and you can just feel this flattening. I just mean that in order to explain this memory that is three-dimensional, you realize there's the memory in your head, there's the idea in your head, and you start writing about it, and you're like, I have to build that up with words. So especially with your own experiences, I think it can be very daunting at first, because you think, but it's all there. I know, I'll just write about this thing, and then this thing, and then you're like, oh my gosh, there is an architecture, there's an infrastructure that I must first create. So that, I think, is daunting. I just mean the process of writing, I think, is not to be underestimated. I mean, it takes hours and discipline that I had to get better at.
It's the treatment. I have so much to talk about with my guest, Carrie Brownstein. We know her from Sleater-Kinney, and of course from Portlandia, and now from her book, Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl. As you were talking about this architecture, though, I was thinking about the way the book starts, which it starts with a trauma and circles us back to it. And basically you say at the end of this trauma, we never talked about it again.
Yeah.
Let's talk about choosing that as an entry point into the book.
Well, I wanted it to be suspenseful. Originally it started without that. It starts with the line, I've always felt unclaimed, which is also, I thought, a good opener. But I wanted to kind of create tension within the narrative. And so I knew if I set the scene with something that was dark and traumatic and sort of spoke of conflict and danger, that would course through the entire book, and you could kind of see it coming.
It's actually a very filmic device to use. I mean, it felt like you talk about that section of back in the days when AMC had black and white movies on it.
Yeah.
I don't think even black and white commercials on AMC anymore. But that idea of using that kind of storytelling is key to the way the book is constructed.
Yeah, and also just, I read a lot of fiction, and I just think I think that kind of, there's a section in the book where I changed to second person. Like, I wanted to, play with that, with style and with form. And, there's a section at the end where instead of writing about Sleater-Kinney's breakup in the first iteration of the band, I deviate basically into an entire metaphor about grief and, substitution in terms of family and loss. So, I wanted it to be an interesting book, and so I wanted to start with that section. Yeah. And I wrote that in one sitting, the intro. Later, almost right before I turned in the final manuscript, I decided the conclusion of it and the meat of that section was later in the book. But I realized that I wanted to go back and start with it. So that was a late decision on my part, and I'm happy with that as the introduction. The book has a lot to do with visibility versus invisibility and embodiment versus feeling disembodied. And I think part of that feeling of visibility is how striking it is to realize kind of how other people are seeing you or how other people are viewing a situation, how that often differs drastically from your own. And I think, that crops up, early on with my mother when she's in the hospital. And then, of course, later dealing with Sleater-Kinney and sort of, our self-identity versus, how other people perceived us.
The phrase I may hate most in all pop music, besides black music is Riot Girl.
Yeah.
I can't stand that.
I know. It doesn't mean anything to me in terms of music. It doesn't describe anything sonically at all.
It's a pose. It's a brand.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. And because Riot Girl has come back into vogue a little bit.
But now it's being used kind of ironically rather than...
Yeah, but it's like that term is kind of cropping up again. And Sleater-Kinney put out a record last year, and we heard that term again. And it's still, it's like, it always feels like you're kind of like, that feeling when you have like something like a fly or something, or it's just like this nuisance. It's like, what is that? Oh gosh, I guess I have to deal with this thing again. And I'm not talking about what Riot Girls stood for or its importance. I'm just talking about it as a descriptor of music. I'm just always like shooing it. Just it makes me feel a little bit uneasy. Like you're saying, when you hear the term black music, you're just like, I don't know. You're just like, what is? Yes, and.
Is that like black comedy?
Yeah.
Explain to me what black music means. I don't know what that means, except as some kind of rubric to describe what people feel is a moment, rather than an actual exploration of what the effect was. And again, seeing that kind of stuff used on you guys when you're playing and the White Stripes are opening for you and there's a woman on drums before you go, well, so they're all the same?
Yeah.
Is not the White Stripes are like half Riot Girl? I don't know what this is.
Yeah, half Riot Girl. That's how we should let Jack White know that they were a half Riot Girl band.
But I just, for me, it's that sort of constant thing, though, in the book, again, about that moment of, when you're acting, you must feel this. And when you're doing Portlandia, there's a point where you do something and you look at the footage afterwards, you go, I did that?
Yes, there is something. I mean, you were talking about possession earlier and just, sort of delving like so deep into a moment, sort of owning it to the point where you're disowning the certain element of reality, I guess, in terms of you're like the sort of quotidian version of your life. You eschew for a moment and you're possessed by this performance or a character or the dynamic between you and the music or you and the other performer. And it's almost like you don't realize what it is until later. But I think that kind of submersion is very important.
I think it's really, though, something that you're looking at and you admire people who can do it.
Mm-hmm. In terms of those interpersonal dynamics, I think it's less extreme, but it is scary to kind of give yourself over to those moments of discomfort. I mean, it is sort of like sitting in sort of a foreign environment and letting yourself be kind of lost in all of the translational difficulties.
But you don't allow yourself to wallow in the discomfort. You just want to explain it. I mean, you just want to get a handle. You want to get your arms around it, don't you?
Well, that's easier than wallowing in it for me.
Is it?
Yeah. I think I admire people that can wallow in discomfort. That to me is like what meditation is. That sitting through the discomfort until you get to the other side of it. I would be the worst person at like a silent meditation retreat. Because I would just be like, guys, isn't this crazy? Let's talk about this discomfort right now. Why? Who else's back hurts? Who else is feeling a slight numbness in their left foot? Like, if we talk about it, it will go away, right? It's like my goal, this should be, I didn't make a resolution, but if I did, I would say kind of a life goal is to actually be able to sit with that discomfort a little more instead of going right into the explanatory and observational analytical mode.
Well, we're out of time. My guest, who's trying to make herself sound way more superficial than she is Carrie Brownstein. We know her from Portlandia, from Sleater-Kinney. You should now know her from a terrific book, Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl. I can't thank you enough for doing this, really.
I really appreciate you having me on the show.
You haven't heard the show before. Let me thank our recording engineer here at NPR, Where's My Your Call. The show is mixed by Kat Yor, is edited by Blake White, who's the associate producer. I don't care. I don't make chicken soup or like your friend Terry Gross makes you dumpling soup. God's sake. It's The Treatment. To catch up on past episodes of The Treatment, go to KCRW.com or listen on your smartphone with KCRW's mobile apps, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts. The Treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.